At Thanksgiving, my sister pointed at the folding chair in the corner and said, "That's where you belong. Out of the way." My mom laughed. "Be grateful you're even invited." I looked around and discovered my seat wasn't even set. So I quietly slid the final envelope into the turkey platter. This was the last meal on me. Then I walked out, and the power cut off 15 minutes later. I, 29M, had been funding my family's Thanksgiving dinner for 3 years straight, and this year would be my last. The turkey alone cost me $400 from the organic farm my sister specifically requested. The sides, wine, decorations, another $600. Every year I told myself it was worth it to keep the family together, especially after Dad passed. But standing in Mom's kitchen that Thursday afternoon, watching my sister arrange the dining room like she was hosting royalty, I realized I'd been buying my way into a family that didn't want me there. My sister had always been the golden child. Perfect grades, perfect husband, perfect kids who never caused trouble. Meanwhile, I was the disappointment who dropped out of college to start my own landscaping business. The business that now generated enough income to subsidize their holiday meals while they treated me like hired help. She walked past me carrying the centerpiece I'd paid for and stopped. That's when she pointed at the folding chair tucked in the corner between the china cabinet and the wall. She told me that's where I belonged, out of the way. Mom looked up from arranging the napkins and laughed, telling me to be grateful I was even invited. The words hit me like cold water, but what really drove the knife home was when I looked at the dining table and saw my seat wasn't even set. 8 place settings for 9 people. They'd literally forgotten to include me in their own head count. I stood there for a moment, processing the casual cruelty of it all. 3 years of playing the family ATM, and they couldn't even remember to give me a proper seat at the table. The folding chair was my reward for keeping their traditions alive with my money. That's when I remembered the envelope in my jacket pocket. 2 weeks earlier, I'd made a decision. I'd grown tired of being treated like a walking wallet by people who claimed to love me. So I'd done something I never thought I'd have the courage to do. I'd started documenting everything. Every payment I'd made, every favor I'd done, every time they'd taken advantage of my generosity without so much as a thank you. The envelope contained copies of all the receipts from this dinner, along with a letter I'd written but never planned to deliver. Until now. I walked to the kitchen and pulled the envelope from my jacket. My sister was in the living room, setting up the kids' table. Mom was upstairs changing clothes. The turkey sat golden and perfect on the counter, waiting to be carried to the dining room. I slid the envelope underneath the platter, where it would be discovered when someone lifted the bird to carve it. Then I grabbed my jacket and headed for the door. My sister called after me, asking where I was going. I told her I remembered I had somewhere else to be. She rolled her eyes and said I was being dramatic, that I could come back and help serve when I was done with my tantrum. Mom came downstairs and asked what was happening. My sister explained that I was upset about the seating arrangement, making it sound like I was throwing a fit over nothing. I opened the door and looked back at them one last time. I told them this was the last meal on me. My sister laughed and said she'd hold me to that, not realizing I was dead serious. I walked to my truck and drove 3 blocks before pulling over and making the phone call I'd been planning for weeks. The automated system answered immediately, and I entered the account number I'd memorized. Within 30 seconds, I'd successfully canceled the electrical service to Mom's house, the service that had been in my name and paid by my credit card for the past 2 years. Most people didn't realize that when someone died, utility companies required new applications and credit checks before transferring service. After Dad passed, Mom's credit was too poor to qualify on her own. I'd quietly taken over the account to help her keep the lights on, adding it to the growing list of bills I paid to keep my family afloat. The power would shut off in exactly 15 minutes, long enough for me to get home, not long enough for them to figure out what happened before their Thanksgiving dinner went cold. I drove home and poured myself a drink. Then I waited. The first call came at 4:30. My sister's voice was panicked, asking if I knew anything about the power going out. I told her I had no idea and suggested she call the electric company. She said she'd tried, but they were closed for the holiday. I expressed sympathy for their situation and hung up. The second call came an hour later. Mom this time, her voice strained with frustration. She said the whole neighborhood had power except for her house, and she couldn't understand why. I suggested maybe there was an issue with her specific connection and recommended she check the breaker box. She said my brother-in-law had already tried that. By 6 o'clock, their perfectly planned Thanksgiving dinner was completely ruined. The turkey had gone cold, the sides were congealing, and the house was getting chilly as the November evenings set in. My sister called again, this time openly hostile, demanding to know if I'd done something to cause this. I asked her what possible reason I could have for wanting to ruin Thanksgiving dinner. After all, I was just the family disappointment who belonged in the corner, out of the way. That's when she realized I wasn't coming back. The third call came at 7:30. Mom was crying now, saying she'd found my letter. She'd discovered it when they finally decided to carve the cold turkey, hoping to salvage something from the meal. The envelope had contained every receipt from the past 3 years: groceries, utilities, car repairs I'd paid for, medical bills I'd helped with. The letter explained that I was done being their secret benefactor while being treated like a burden. But the real revelation was at the bottom of the letter, where I'd itemized exactly what they'd lost by pushing me away. Not just the money, though the running total of my contributions over 3 years was enough to make them both gasp, but the emotional labor of being the family member who actually cared enough to show up, pay up, and put up with their treatment. Mom begged me to come back, saying they could talk about this. I told her we were talking about it right now, over the phone, while she sat in her dark, cold house trying to figure out how she was going to pay her electric bill next month. She asked if I was really going to abandon the family over a seating arrangement. I explained that it wasn't about where I sat. It was about the fact that they'd forgotten to seat me at all, after I'd paid for everything on that table. It was about 3 years of being treated like a necessary evil rather than a family member they actually wanted around. The calls continued throughout the evening. My sister tried guilt, reminding me of how much Mom had sacrificed raising us alone after Dad died. I reminded her that Mom wasn't alone. She had a daughter with a 6-figure household income who could start contributing to the family finances anytime she felt ready. My brother-in-law called around 9, trying to play mediator. He said everyone was sorry about the seating situation, that they just hadn't thought it through. I told him that was exactly the problem. They never thought about me at all, except when they needed something paid for. By 10 o'clock, they'd given up on fixing the power and decamped to my sister's house across town. But the damage was done. Their perfect Thanksgiving was ruined, and they were finally beginning to understand how much they'd taken me for granted. Update 1. The next morning brought a flurry of apologetic text messages. My sister had apparently spent the night calculating how much money she'd need to cover the bills I'd been handling, and the reality was sobering. Mom's electric bill alone was $200 a month in the old, poorly insulated house. Add in the groceries, gas money, and various emergency repairs I'd covered, and they were looking at taking on nearly $1,000 in monthly expenses they'd grown comfortable ignoring. But the real wake-up call came when Mom tried to get the electricity turned back on. The utility company informed her that since the account had been in my name, she'd need to apply for new service. With her credit score and fixed income, they wanted a $400 deposit she didn't have. My sister called me that afternoon, her tone completely different from the night before. She wanted to know what it would take for me to turn the power back on. I told her it wasn't that simple. Once you cancel an account, you can't just flip it back on like a light switch. The utility company would need to process a new application, run credit checks, and schedule a reconnection. More importantly, I told her I wasn't interested in resuming my role as the family's financial safety net. If they wanted me in their lives, it would have to be because they actually wanted me there, not because they needed my wallet. She tried to argue that family should help family, that it was selfish of me to withdraw support over hurt feelings. I reminded her that for 3 years, I'd been the only one in the family helping anyone. She and her husband made nearly twice what I did, yet somehow I was always the one covering emergencies and extras. The conversation ended with her accusing me of holding the family hostage with money. I pointed out that I was doing the exact opposite. I was freeing them from any obligation to pretend they cared about me for financial reasons. Now they could have an authentic relationship with me, or no relationship at all. Update 2. A week later, Mom called to tell me she'd managed to get the power turned back on. My sister had loaned her the deposit money, and they'd set up a payment plan for the reconnection fees. She sounded proud of herself for handling the situation, as if she'd accomplished something remarkable by paying her own utility bill. She asked if I was ready to put this whole mess behind us and move on. I asked her what exactly she thought we were moving on to. She said things could go back to the way they were before, that we could have a nice Christmas together if I was willing to let bygones be bygones. I realized then that she still didn't understand what had happened. She thought this was about my feelings being hurt, not about a fundamental change in our relationship dynamic. She expected me to resume funding their lifestyle while accepting whatever scraps of attention they felt like throwing my way. I explained that there was no going back to the way things were. The old relationship had been built on an unsustainable foundation where I gave everything and received nothing. If she wanted a relationship with me going forward, it would have to be based on mutual respect and reciprocity. She got quiet for a long time, then asked what I wanted from them. I told her I didn't want anything from them. That was the entire point. I wanted them to want something from me besides money. I wanted to be invited to family gatherings because they enjoyed my company, not because they needed me to pay for the meal. The conversation ended with her promising to think about what I'd said. Update 3. Christmas came and went without any contact from my family. I spent the day volunteering at a local homeless shelter, serving meals to people who appreciated the gesture without expecting it. It was the most peaceful holiday I'd had in years. 2 days after Christmas, my sister showed up at my house. She looked exhausted, and for the first time in years, she seemed to be seeing me as more than just a walking ATM. She said she'd been doing a lot of thinking since Thanksgiving, and she realized how unfairly they'd been treating me. She apologized for the folding chair comment, for forgetting to set my place at the table, for taking my generosity for granted year after year. She admitted that somewhere along the way, they'd started seeing my contributions as obligations rather than gifts, and they'd lost sight of the fact that I was choosing to help them. But what surprised me most was when she handed me an envelope containing a check for half of what I'd spent on Thanksgiving dinner. She said it wasn't much, but she wanted to start paying me back for some of what I'd contributed over the years. More importantly, she wanted to start contributing herself instead of always being on the receiving end. We talked for 3 hours that afternoon. Really talked, for the first time since we were kids. She told me about the financial stress she and her husband had been under, how they'd been struggling to maintain their lifestyle while saving for their kids' college funds. I shared my frustration with feeling invisible in my own family, valued only for what I could provide rather than who I was. By the time she left, we'd agreed to try rebuilding our relationship on more equal ground. She would take over Mom's utility bills, and I would step back from my role as family financier. If I wanted to contribute to special occasions, it would be my choice, not my default responsibility. The change wasn't immediate or perfect. Old habits and expectations don't disappear overnight. But slowly, over the following months, our family dynamic began to shift. Mom started calling me just to check in, not just when she needed something fixed or paid for. My sister invited me to her kids' school events, and when I showed up empty-handed, no one seemed to mind. The real test came the following Thanksgiving. This time, my sister hosted, and when I walked into her dining room, there was a proper place setting waiting for me at the table. No folding chair in the corner, no afterthought seating arrangement. Just a spot at the family table that had been prepared specifically for me. When we sat down to eat, my sister raised her glass and said she was thankful for second chances and brothers who were brave enough to demand better treatment. Mom nodded and added that she was grateful for family members who cared enough to fight for what the relationship could become, not just what it had always been. I looked around the table at their faces and realized something had fundamentally changed. They weren't looking at me with the casual indifference I'd grown accustomed to. They were seeing me as someone they genuinely wanted there, someone whose absence would have left a real void in their celebration. The turkey was store-bought, not organic. The wine was moderately priced, not top shelf. The decorations were simple, not elaborate. But for the first time in years, I felt like I was actually part of the family gathering rather than just funding it from the sidelines. After dinner, as we were cleaning up, my sister pulled me aside and thanked me for not giving up on them completely. She said the power going out that night had been a wake-up call they desperately needed, even if they'd been too proud to admit it at the time. I told her that walking out of that house had been one of the hardest things I'd ever done, but it had also been necessary. Sometimes you have to be willing to lose something completely before people realize what they're actually losing. The envelope I'd left under the turkey platter had contained more than just receipts and grievances. It had contained a challenge, the challenge to decide whether they wanted me in their lives for who I was, not what I could do for them. It had taken them a while to understand the question, even longer to decide how to answer it. But in the end, they'd chosen to answer correctly. And that made all the difference.